Hello and welcome again to the International Soccer Preview by Soccer Files Canada. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Connor. And today we will be updating Honduras in the final round of CONCACAF qualifying for World Cup 2022. Before the round, we did a team preview and a player preview for each team. We won't be repeating all that information here, but we do urge you to check out those earlier podcasts at our website at soccerfiles.captivate.fm. But let's summarize the information covered in each of those podcasts. We gave a more detailed summary in our first podcast of this series, which was for Canada.
Right, so the longer version is in the Canada file, but the shorter version is right here. So for the team podcast, we gave some information on the country, its location and population, a summary of their history in World Cup competition and in regional competition, with a closer look at their recent history. We took a brief look at their players, especially the goal scorers in that team podcast. And then we looked at their rankings, head-to-head record, with the other teams in the groups. And finally, we had a discussion of their schedule and prospects.
Right, and for each of the player podcasts, we organized the team into positions and looked at the players who had been filling those positions in recent times. We gave some biographical information on them, specifically their history with the national team, and predicted who were the main candidates for each position. So in this podcast, we won't be repeating all of that. Rather, we will be looking back on how this round has gone for each team and how correct we were in our predictions of their performance and their players. Sometimes we were right, but sometimes other players we expected to be used were not. New players also came in.
And that's actually particularly the case with the Honduras podcast, because we didn't take a close look at their Olympic qualifying teams. So there were a few unexpected players that we used. So again, we're urging listeners to regard this as a companion podcast to the first two. And as Connor said, we won't be repeating biographical information for players discussed in that first podcast, but we will give that information for any new players that have come in.
Right. And finally, we will look towards the future and discuss the prospects of each team and their players from this midpoint forward. So again, here we are looking at Honduras after 8 of 14 games played.
All right, let's begin then by looking at the performance of the team so far. And Eep looking pretty grim there. A lot of red for 5 losses and 3 draws and no wins.
Yeah, the only team without a win so far and sitting at the bottom of the pile with just 3 points. It has been fairly bleak for them. From 4 games at home, they picked up just 1 point. That was a goalless draw with Costa Rica, losing there to the U.S., Jamaica, and Panama. And then just the 2 points coming in their first 2 road games, Canada and El Salvador. But they have lost their last 4 straight. So, yeah, they don't seem to be turning this around at present.
Yeah, not a bad start, especially considering how well Canada has been doing. A draw in Canada and then a draw in El Salvador. We generally say that if you can draw on the road and win at home, you're doing okay. So they got off to a good start with 2 away draws, but it's been pretty grim after that. Just the 1 point in 6 games. And in fact, they fired their manager after game 6. That was the home loss to Jamaica. Any other comments on that? They've been a bit unlucky too.
Yeah, they have lost on some late goals and suffered some comebacks. So I agree that luck's played a part. And I also agree with what you said. Drawing their first 2 games on the road, that's pretty positive. They lost to the USA. That might be expected. But I really look at those last 3 games in particular. 2 home losses against Jamaica and Panama. Those are teams they're capable of beating. And then an away loss in Costa Rica. So 0 points from those games is massively disappointing.
Yeah, and a bit, I don't know what happened there against Panama, but they were 2-0 up at the 77th minute mark. And then Panama scored 3 goals in 8 minutes to win 3-2. Wow.
Yeah, very unlucky. And then In their most recent game, Costa Rica scored a very late winner, winning at the 95th minute. So 2 late losses in a row, kind of heartbreakers.
Yeah, a bit heartbreaking, but definitely a problem. And maybe when we look at the team here, we'll start getting some insight into what's going on there. Let's take a look at the scorers so far. Just 6 goals in 8 games. I don't know if we mentioned that. Sorry, 5 goals in 8 games. Obviously, offense is a bit of the problem, Connor.
It is, and it's not up on the graphic, but 15 goals conceded is the worst defensive record as well. So they're struggling really at both ends of the pitch. Brea and Moya with 2 goals as their leading goal scorer so far.
Yeah, I mean, we see Albert Ellis and Rommel Kyoto both got goals, but if you recall from the previous podcast, they were both injured at the end of the Gold Cup and injured for the first few games. Here, they started making their way back in, so maybe that'll help them a bit going forward. Okay, and then 1 red card to the stolid centre back, Maynor Figueroa. So he took that red card. I think it was in game 5 and then was suspended for game 6. So because he's really the only consistent central defender they have, that too was a bit of a blow.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, taking that red card in the game against Mexico and then missing the game against Jamaica.
Right. Okay, well, before we look at players, we'll look at the formations they've been using. Do you want to talk through that?
Sure. So a 4-4-2 has kind of been their default formation. They use that for the first 3 games as well as the last 2. And then they experimented with a couple games in the middle, going to 4-5-1 against Costa Rica, playing 5 defenders against Mexico, but away, so perhaps understandable, and then a 4-2-3-1 against Jamaica. So since the new manager came in for the last 2 games, they've reverted to the 4-4-2 that they started with. So I guess that can be considered their kind of default formation.
Yeah, that's right. And as we saw, they actually didn't do too badly in those last 2 games, but unfortunately, both were late comebacks by the other team or late goals by the other team. But maybe it's a good sign that they were at least competitive in those games. Okay, we'll move on to players. And as I said, the matters were a bit complicated in our original podcast by the fact that Honduras had competed in the Olympics. We had made out that Honduras's reliance on older players was a bit worrisome, and the need for renewal was great, but we didn't pay much attention to the younger players on the Olympic squad. That was because we hadn't seen them play a lot for the team, so we were kind of awaiting to see how they would shape up in this qualification. But mea culpa, we did ignore it, so we might have seen a couple of the players coming through.
Yeah, and the ones that have come through we'll mention as we go through.
Right, so the Honduras team is probably the one most in need of an update. And how about the manager, Connor?
Well, in need of an update as well. Fabian Coito was sacked on October 13th following their home loss to Jamaica in Game 6. Their record at that time was 0 wins, 3 draws, and 3 losses. Hernan Dario Gomez, he was brought in and has taken charge of the last 2. He has a long history as a manager. He's actually taken 3 teams to the World Cup. One of very few people to do that. That was Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama most recently. He took Panama to their first World Cup in 2018. So he has experience in this region, and he comes in as a manager to, probably salvage what they can for the remainder of this campaign. Under Coito, Honduras tied Canada in their opening game, and despite a good performance in the 1-1 draw, Game 2 saw the defense completely replaced. only to return to Games 1 formation in Game 3. So kind of a mysterious call there by the previous manager, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through.
Yeah, it was quite odd. I mean, maybe they had expected to beat Canada because they often did. But looking back on that, that's probably their best result so far. That 1-1 draw in their first game. All right. Well, looking at goalkeepers, that's a pretty easy one to talk about because it's Luis Lopez who has started all 8 games. In the original podcast, we commented on perhaps an overdependence on him and the lack of experience of any backup keeper should he get injured. But fortunately for them, he hasn't. However, the backup keepers have been Edric Menjivar and Rafael Zuniga. And Menjivar has just 3 caps and Zuniga has none. So it kind of illustrates the danger we're talking about. Menjivar is 28 years old and he had been the backup keeper in the 2021 Gold Cup. Zuniga had been backup in the 2019 Gold Cup, but he hadn't appeared on the bench after November 2019. Marlon Lincoln, who was on the bench as backup keeper in 2021, was not selected at all for these games.
Right, moving on to central defense, 38-year-old Maynor Figueroa remains a fixture at the back. He's been paired with various other defenders, Marcelo Pereira for games 1 and 3, Daniil Maldonado for game 4. Figueroa got a red card in game 5 where he had been partnered in a 3-man defense with both Pereira and Maldonado, and those two were paired up in the following game. But they were gone after that, and Figueroa was paired with Carlos Melendez for games 7 and 8. As we mentioned, game 2 saw the defense completely replaced for one match. Johnny Leveron and newcomer Jose Garcia came into central defense. Leveron would play as a right back in game 6 for his only other appearance, while Garcia would sub into one more game, but both were off the squad by the last 2 games. So a very brief appearance in general. We talked about Pereira in the initial podcast, but we hadn't mentioned Daniil Maldonado. Though he had 5 caps for the national team from 2019 before this, he was part of and in fact captain of the Olympic team. So he was not part of the Gold Cup 2021 squad. Carlos Melendez had first appeared on the bench in October 2020 for the national team, but games 7 and 8 under the first manager were his first 2 caps, so brought in very fresh for those. And then veteran Henry Figueroa, he made no appearances and seems now to be off the team.
Yeah, we had been wondering in the initial podcast where he had gotten to because he really was the partner to Maynor Figueroa at the back for a long time, and then he just kind of suddenly disappeared, and he hasn't reappeared since. But curious why they're not bringing him in. There must be a reason.
Yeah, he is younger than Maynor Figueroa, who I believe is his brother.
Yeah, he's only. Are they brothers?
I believe so.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he's 29 years old, so he's not nearly as old as Maynor Figueroa. All right, let's move on to the left back position. And the left back position also experimented with several players. Diego Rodriguez held the position in game 1 and was replaced by Danilo Acosta in the defensive overhaul that was game 2. And then Diego Rodriguez returned for games 3 and 4. Acosta came back in game 5, but Johnny Leveron was chosen for game 6. And then in game 7 and 8 under the new manager, we saw the installation of Omar Elvier. We have seen veteran Johnny Leveron as a central defender in some of the games, but Omar Elvier is an interesting choice. At 32 years old, he earned his second and third caps for the national team here, returning a year after his first cap, which was in November 2020. And his only other appearance was on the bench in March 2020. So again, looks like his first cap for the national team was at 31 years old. There. Ever Alvarado, who we talked about in the initial podcast, has made no appearance since June 2021. But at 29 years old, he may come back into the picture. But that's not likely true for Emilio Izaguirre. He was the entrenched left back in 2019, but he last appeared in November 2020 and is now 35 years old.
Switching to the right back position, we had expected this to be Felix Cressanto, the starting right back in the Gold Cup. However, he was only used in the Game 2 defensive shakeup and was not called up after that. The position was instead taken by the surprise return of Andy Najar, who didn't even feature in our original podcast. He had last appeared for Honduras for one friendly in June 2019, for 2 games in 2017 and 2 in 2016, as well as the 2015 Gold Cup, which had ended a fairly consistent run in the team. However, here he started games 1, 3, 4, and 6, and played notably well in Game 1 against Canada. However, he hasn't been selected so far by the new manager. Rather, Kevin Alvarez was selected for the last 2 games under the new manager. He had actually started Game 5 under the old manager, Coito. He played all 4 games in the Gold Cup as a central defender, but here he resumed his coded position as a right back. Raul Marcelo Santos, right back in Game 4 of the Gold Cup, was not selected here, and 36-year-old Brian Beckles proved that his last appearance would be in the 2019 Gold Cup.
All right, so that is the defensive situation for Honduras, and now we're going to move on to midfielders. And just before we start, a quick word on general or versatile midfielders. Brian Acosta in the original podcast was presented as a roving midfielder, but in these games he stuck fairly close to his designation as a central midfielder, so we'll consider him there. As far as defensive or central midfielders go, it's been a lot of shipping and changing, so this section is a bit complex. So Honduras played mostly a 4-4-2 in the early and latter games, as we saw, experimenting in the middle with 5 or with 3 midfielders. So again, we're going to combine the defensive and central midfielders because of this. So the first 2 names are Davy Flores and Kevin Arriaga. They were paired for the first 4 games, except for the shake-up of Game 2, where both were benched. A third central midfielder was added in Game 4. We'll talk about him soon. And that set continued into Game 5, although Davy Flores was not part of that 3-man midfield. However, he and Arriaga resumed their 2-man partnership in Game 6. The new manager experimented with different combinations for the last 2 games, with Arriaga out and Alfredo Maya in. Okay, so unpacking that a bit more, Flores was expected. He had been in the position consistently since returning from a 2.5-year absence in March 2021, and he played all 4 Gold Cup games there too. Kevin Arriaga, though, he was a surprise. He had only 2 caps and had not been selected for the Gold Cup. So the pairing in the Game 2 shakeup was Oscar Boniek Garcia and Brian Acosta, both veterans of the team. It was Garcia's last start, but Acosta went on to starts in Game 5 and Game 8. Alexander Lopez joined the midfield actually for 1 game. He was part of the 3-man central midfield in Game 4, but he's actually an attacking midfielder, so we'll examine him when we look at that position. Carlos Pineda, who joined the three-man central midfield in Game 5, was a defensive midfielder. He had been fairly regularly on the team since September 2019 and was not in the Gold Cup only because he was with the Olympic team. He had also subbed or been on the bench for all of the qualifying games to that point, but this proved his only start, Game 5 that is, and he was not called up by the new manager for the last two games. Rather, the new manager installed Alfredo Maya and paired him with Davy Flores in Game 7 and with Brian Acosta in Game 8. Alfred Maya is a 31-year-old veteran and has 49 caps for the national team. And actually, he was entrenched in this position until 2018, but had only played one friendly since then. And finally, we had mentioned three other candidates in the original podcast. Edwin Tolano was involved in two games, but all in all only got 4 minutes of field time and was off the team for the last 5 games. 23-year-old Jorge Alvarez has not appeared since November 2020, and 31-year-old Luis Garrido has not appeared since 2019.
Great. Well, a lot of players in that position.
Yeah.
And left midfielders, which I'll talk about, there's some movement there as well. We had noted in the original podcast that Honduras have few designated left midfielders or wingers. The one viable candidate they had, Jorge Alvarez, was not used and had not appeared for the team since November 2020, as you just mentioned. Attacking midfielders fill this role, except in Game 3, where the three-man midfield formation made a defensive midfielder more suitable for that position. Rigobert Rivas started in the position, but was changed to Jonathan Toro in the overhaul that was Game 2. Toro retained the position for Game 3, but Rivas returned in Game 4. Brian Acosta was the left side of the three-man midfield in Game 5, and Brian Moya, who had mostly played as a forward to that point, played the last 3 games as a left midfielder. Rigobert Rivas had switched to right midfielder for Game 2, but dwindled to a substitute role after Game 4 and hasn't been selected by the new manager. The 23-year-old was with the Olympic team in the summer, so was not part of the Gold Cup selection. Jonathan Toro was selected for neither, despite being a regular on the national team since 2019. After playing on the left for Games 2 and 3, Toro was not called up again until the last game, where he warmed the bench. Brian Moya started all but Game 2 as a forward in Games 1, 3, and 5, a right midfielder in Game 4, and as a left midfielder for the last 2 games. He was also with the Olympic team instead of the Gold Cup. At 29 years old, he was playing as one of the 3 allowed overage players.
Right, so he seems to be used quite a bit, but a lot of the other ones have kind of drifted off the team, especially under the new manager. Let's move over to the right side. Sorry, I got the graphics mixed up a bit here. On the right side, there are not many active players designated in this position. Like the left midfield, it's out of position players who usually fill the role. And in fact, we've met most of them already. Connor talked about attacking midfielders Rigobert Rivas and Brian Moya, and they were there on the right side for Games 2 and 4 respectively, and defensive midfielder Carlos Pineda played the role in Games 3 and 5. For Game 1, it was central midfielder Edwin Rodriguez, another young Olympic team player. For Edwin Rodriguez, Game 1 was his only start until Game 8, where he lined up as a forward. He was a substitute otherwise, but he wasn't on the roster for 3 of the 8 games. And finally, Albert Ellis is the only player designated for the position. He's a really important player, and they sorely missed him when he was injured with a broken toe from Game 3 of the Gold Cup. He returned here in Game 4, but as a forward, but he assumed this position on the right midfield from Game 6 onwards.
Yeah, they're happy to have him back for sure.
Definitely.
All right, we'll move to the forward line, and we'll begin, as we always do, with attacking midfielders. The 4-4-2 formation usually used by Honduras does not lend itself to an attacking midfielder or kind of secondary striker position. We have seen their attacking midfielders positioned on the wings, and in that formation, the players were higher up the field than those in the middle. And we've talked about them. This is Rigobert Rivas, Brian Moya, and Jonathan Toro. We've talked about them already. The only central attacking midfielder to discuss here is Alexander Lopez, who we introduced in the original podcast. He started half their games as a forward in the first and last games, and as a midfielder in games 4 and 6. Only in the 4-2-3-1 formation of Game 6 was he obviously in an attacking midfielder role.
Right, and now we move on to the forwards proper, and again, a lot of names to deal with here. Those who watched the Gold Cup or listened to the initial podcast will recall the trouble Honduras had with all of their forwards getting injured, such that they really had no attacking force to put against Mexico in the quarterfinal game. That continued to plague them in the early part of these qualifications, and it explains why we're seeing so many midfielders in the attacking role and why they scored only 2 goals in their first 6 games. So midfielder Alexander Lopez and Brian Moya made up the attacking pair in Game 1. The sweeping changes of Game 2 did see the actual forwards return. Anthony Lozano and perhaps their best striker, Romel Kyoto, were back. But perhaps they weren't recovered. Only Lozano started the next game and played just half of it. Similarly, Kyoto played only half of Games 2 and 3, coming in as a substitute in Game 3, but both were gone for the following 3 games. Anthony Lozano started Game 7, but again lasted only a little more than half the game. Encouragingly, though, Kyoto played all of Game 8, and he scored their only goal. Otherwise, it was back to midfielders, using midfielders, and the most attacking of them was Albert Ellis, who we've seen. He played as a sole striker in Game 4. Anthony Tejeda was called up after a 4-year absence and drafted in for Games 5 and 6. He was the lone striker in Game 6, but he too was dropped by the new manager. We saw Lozano return in Game 7 and Kyoto play Game 8, and they were paired with midfielders that we've met, Brian Moya and Edwin Rodriguez, respectively. But perhaps more significant is players that were not used. We saw that 34-year-old Jerry Bengston was used in the Gold Cup. Having played only 5 games for the national team since 2015, he was already just filling in the gaps, and perhaps it was his last offering. He had no role in these qualifying games. We'd also talked about Michael Chiranos, who had been brought in from the cold for the Gold Cup, his last game having been in 2019. But he got injured before the Cup and was replaced. And George Bengucci, who had been with the Olympic team in the summer, also played no role in these qualification games for reasons unknown.
All right, we'll talk just briefly about some key substitutes that we haven't really mentioned. Eddie Hernandez was on the bench for the first 2 games, but subbed into Game 4 games after that. However, he was not selected at all by the new manager for the last 2. We saw that Oscar Boniek Garcia started in the shakeup that was game 2. Such a veteran as he is, that he was named captain for that game. He was a substitute for the first 6 games, but only used beyond that game 2 start for one other game. He was also not selected at all by the new manager for the last 2 matches. Rubilio Castillo, who had been called up to the national team only twice since scoring 2 goals in the 2019 Gold Cup, was selected for the last 2 games. He subbed in at the 89th minute for both, but maybe used a bit more going forward.
Okay, we'll also kind of review the new players that have been brought in. And the first one is Carlos Melendez. So we saw him as a central defender. Omar Elvier was installed as the left defender by the new manager, and Kervin Arriaga has played some games in the central midfield. And finally, we'll touch on the notably absent.
Well, I guess the first would be Fabian Coyoto, the manager, but then also Henry Figueroa and Jerry Bankston, 2 players that have been around the team quite a bit in the past, haven't been involved so far.
Yeah, that's right. So a little hard to determine the default lineup right now, because there are a lot of changes made in the last 2 games. So some of those players brought in might be used going forward, but we'll give it a shot here. And do you want to take us through that, Connor?
Yeah, we'll try and simplify it as much as we can. So Hernan Dario Gomez, of course, the new manager. The goalkeeper, there's no debate there. It's Luis Lopez. Central defenders, really the only one firmly entrenched is Maynor Figueroa. At left back, you have Omar Elvier, and then right back, Kelvin Alvarez. In midfield, we've listed Davy Flores as the kind of main defensive and central midfielder, along with Kervin Arriaga and Alfredo Mejia. On the left midfield, we've identified Brian Moya, and on the right midfield, Albert Ellis, again, one of their main attacking threats. For attacking midfielders, they have Alexander Lopez, and then for forwards, really no one identified. As we've said, they used a variety of midfielders to kind of fill those roles so far, but no one really leading the line, which, is a problem for them.
Yeah, and that brings us back to the team discussion, and we said we tried to shed some light on what's going wrong for Honduras, and especially in the goal scoring department. The problem is really they had no forwards in the Gold Cup, and they have no forwards now. I mean, they have a lot of names to work with, but certainly no one has emerged as kind of the main forward. I wonder if Romelio Kyoto was intended to be the man, but I think we saw that he wasn't there for the last few games.
Yeah, hopefully for them that he'll be used more forward. He plays in the MLS with Montreal, I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
But they'll need to establish someone there. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the chopping and changing is partly due to a new manager, but also, a team that's struggling is always likely perhaps to be a bit more experimental, to bring in new players, to change them. Whether that's always helpful or not, I think you can make arguments either way, but I think it does speak to the struggle that they've had to try and find some consistency and also try and find some results. Most importantly, that there is a lot of change, with them sitting at the bottom. And we may even see more of that, if they consider, qualification is beyond them.
Yeah, I made a bit of a mistake in my summary there. Actually, Romelio Kyoto started game 8, and that was his... the first time he played a full game back from injury. So with Albert Ellis back and Romelio Kyoto, maybe they can provide a bit more attack in their upcoming games. Let's look at those upcoming games. They play the first 2 games at home. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, they start with group leaders Canada, who, they do have a good record against, particularly at home. But I think this is a Canada side that's looked very different to ones Honduras has played recently. And then they're home to El Salvador. El Salvador just above them in the standings, 3 points, but only one spot above them in the standings. After that, it's trips away to USA, Panama. Then they have a daunting home game against Mexico, and finally finish away in Jamaica. So, what do you think? Do you see potential for wins there?
I mean, they play the top 4 teams in the first 5 games. I know from a personal perspective, Canada will be looking for some revenge, not only for the tie at the beginning of the qualification there, the home tie in Canada, but if you recall, I think it was 2014 where they lost 8-0.
Yeah, in a must-win game for Canada, they were absolutely smashed in the Honduran heat.
Yeah, so I think Canada will be looking to prove that they're a much better team than that now. So I think that could be a tough game. And yeah, honestly, they're so far 3 points at the bottom of the table. There's little hope for them. Well, certainly from reaching 4th place and a World Cup bid, but maybe little hope for them getting off of the bottom of the table.
Yeah, if they can beat El Salvador in their home game, which they play in the first set of matches when they're back, that would help them. But it has been massive underperformance from a team that's actually made it to to recent World Cups. They've kind of been used to competing with the best, and used to being kind of right in the mix for qualifying. So they're to be 11 points off the playoff spot, just over halfway through. It's a major fall from grace for them. I don't believe they're probably as bad as their 3-point shows, but it's hard to see where points will come from playing so many of the top teams. As you mentioned, they still have to play all 4 of the top teams in the next 5 games. So, at this point, I think it's just a matter of trying to pick up, as many points as they can, and perhaps more importantly, going forward, trying to find the correct combination of players and strikers in particular to fill the role and try and start building for the future, because I think that's probably the biggest positive they can take in these last 6 games, is trying to build towards the future.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think a realistic goal is to maybe try to finish ahead of El Salvador, and as you say, a win against them at home would help a lot as far as that goes. But yeah, pretty much giving up the ghost on this qualification, but just working on developing their team. We did talk in the initial podcast, and even here it's kind of obvious that they got to start working some of these younger players in. If I use central defense as an example, they have a 38-year-old as their main player, and really no one else established next to him. So working on some of those issues, and then working towards kind of future. The future is probably the way to go for them, and maybe that's what they had in mind by hiring a new manager.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's that's realistically what the rest of the campaign is about.
Yeah, but I see you once again being a bit dodgy in answering the question. Will Honduras get off the bottom of the table, Connor?
I'm going to say yes. I think they will finish ahead of El Salvador. I think they will win that game. Despite the last 2 defeats, they were very narrow defeats, as we saw. So that's perhaps something to build off. And, maybe with the new manager coming in, a manager with a good record, hopefully a couple key players coming back like Ellis and Kyoto, I think they may be a little bit better down the stretch than we've seen from them so far. It's not a really high bar, but I do expect them to get some points down the stretch, and I think they'll finish second bottom, if just barely.
Yeah, I got to say I agree with you on that. Honduras is generally a stronger team than El Salvador. As you said, they've made the World Cup a couple of times in the last few decades, and it's a bit embarrassing for them to be at the bottom. I think they'll get out of that, but I don't think they'll be able to catch Jamaica. So second last seems to be second last or last, but I think second last is within their reach, as you said. All right, well, great talking to you about this, Connor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You as well. Just a reminder, if you want to listen to any of our earlier podcasts, you can find them on our website. That's Soccer Files, Soccer Files with a PH, .captivate.fm. And you can also search Soccer Files Canada and find us that way as well.
Great. Well, we hope to see you on the next podcast. The last of the series will be El Salvador. And all the best, Connor.
I'll talk to you then.
You bet. Bye-bye.